that's the sort of thing that might get their attention. This is a long-standing treaty. It's been around, and the United States has complied to the letter for a treaty that limits kind of intermediate-range missiles of various kinds, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. And the significance is that Russia, since around the 2008 timeframe, began to violate this treaty. They didn't pull out of it, as one would normally do in that kind of circumstance, but instead kind of stayed in the treaty but just chose to violate it. And so over the past two administrations, Obama and Trump, called them out and said, look, we know you're violating it, you need to stop, and they chose not to do it. And so this is kind of the United States saying we're not going to be in a treaty that's one-sided, we're going to have to pull out. We'll therefore be able to pursue some kind of capability to take missiles that we perhaps launch from the sea or something like that and put them on trucks, as it were. That gives us the ability to disperse things out and create some additional uncertainty on the part of our adversaries. And that's good for deterrence, it's good for stability, because every day they wake up and they know that they can't decapitate our forces because they're more complicated to strike. And this is especially true for the Asia Pacific, where China, for instance, has many hundreds and hundreds of missiles that target U.S. bases and U.S. ships, and the U.S. doesn't have something comparable because we've been limited by the treaty. All 29 members of NATO spoke with one voice some number of months ago and said, yes, Russia is indeed in violation. We've seen the evidence and we're satisfied by that. It's hard to get all 29 members of NATO to agree on anything, and they agreed on that. And so NATO and the General Secretary for NATO has said, look, we're not going to have nuclear missiles, ground-launched missiles in Europe at this point anyway, but what we're going to have is conventionally armed. And that's the sort of thing that's going to contribute to conventional deterrence. And frankly, it fits in with the European deterrence initiative that we're doing in other ways, putting different allied forces in Eastern Europe so that Russia knows that it's not a good idea to pick a fight with their neighbors.
Today, the INF Treaty ceases to exist.
How is the table going to be reset here? And before we get into any kind of new treaty, we need to have the confidence that the Russians or Chinese or whomever else is actually going to comply. And that's the most important part. And in terms of, you might say, the New START follow-on or something like that, the big options are basically twofold or threefold. One is just to kind of extend it in the same way, just with Russia and just with some of their nuclear weapons. The second option is to have a more comprehensive treaty that covers all nuclear weapons with Russia, including so-called non-strategics, to which the Russians have a 10-to-1 advantage relative to the United States. And then finally, the third option is to try to bring in China. And that last one would be desirable, but how exactly we get China there is, it's going to take a little work, right? Because right now, China's enjoying the benefits of being completely unconstrained by INF, by New START, by anything. So getting China to the table will take a little bit of work. Russia and China, with kind of the false allegations about U.S. violations, things like that, again and again, you see a kind of pattern that Russia and China try to drive wedges between the United States and its allies. And I think if that was part of the calculus with Russia in terms of INF, I think it may have backfired a little bit. Because again, NATO has been speaking with one voice. And if and when the United States does deploy some of these things, that's going to be unpleasant for Russia. They're not going to like how that table gets reset. Big picture here, there's lots of missiles out there, right? And whether they're launched from the land or from sea, this is where Russia and China have been putting their investments to a pretty significant degree. And so what you also see is the United States in Europe, with our allies in Europe, and also with folks like Japan and others, to be pursuing some active measures, active defenses to be able to defend against these things in the event of a bad day where there's a conflict. That aspiration may be a little hard to achieve. So I think we should